So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome again to the virtual reading group. We are in the midst of reading The Human Condition, or as it's sometimes called, the Vita Activa, which was actually Arendt's original title for it, and is the title of the German edition. The book is split into 6 chapters of very unequal lengths and a prologue. We've read the prologue, chapter 1 on the public and private. Chapter 1 on the introduction on the Vita Activa, chapter 2 on the public and private, chapter 3 on labor we finished last week. With a discussion of consumerism and the way that the laboring life process doesn't, in the end, lead to, even if we create surplus labor and create free time, does not lead to a situation in which most of us use that time to, exercise our intellect or build a world or engage in politics, but largely leads to us to labor more in order to consume more in a sort of vicious cycle in Arendt's reading. Today we start chapter 4. It is the second of the middle chapters, which are on labor, work, and action, which are the 3 faculties that she argues have traditionally been part of the human condition, namely not the human nature, but the condition. Conditioned as we are living on this earth, while there's many activities and many faculties that we have and many things that we do, we have in this human world, as long as we've been, writing and thinking about this human world for 2,000 or so years, we need to live, and thus we labor. We need to build. We need to have a political world, and thus we act. And we need to work in order to build and make a stable world, a world in which we can have a home. This chapter on work is an essential chapter in her thinking and in this book, because it's really the chapter where Arendt is concerned with how we make and fabricate a shared world, right? We talk a lot about this in this reading group, and we should, because it's core to Arendt's idea, the idea of a common world or a shared world. And what is that? Well, in some way, it's that world we share. It's the things that are in between. It's that, the fact that we have the screen in between us right now, or as we've talked about many times, a table around which we sit that unifies us as a people. And these things in the world, right? I don't know if any of you own a house, but, the house stands there, and yes, it's used. And maybe it will start to decay. And one day, you may tear it down, or you sell it and someone else tears it down. It's not that they last forever, but they last long enough that their use is not simply to be consumed. You don't simply make them to consume them. You make them to use them, and that use lasts in some way. And that durability is for her important. It's what makes the world a human world, because we make things that last, and that those things then condition us further. The things that last the longest for her, and thus are the quintessential works, are works of art. They are works produced by human hands that their use is questionable, right? They're not really for use, but they are there to be and last and to be looked at and considered. And thus works of art for her are sort of the quintessential works that define our world. And the last section of this chapter 4 on work is going to be about the work of art, and we'll get to that I think in 2 weeks. These first few sections which we read today are the first two, at least, on the durability of the world and reification, are just sort of laying out some of these ideas. I mean, for those of you who have read Arendt for a long time, this seems sort of basic, but we have to remember that this distinction she's made between labor and work really had never been made before. It's one that she developed and saw as she's working and writing about Marx in the early 1950s, and so it's something that she's quite keen to develop, and it's important for her. I think both on the labor side and the work side, because the labor side, the real distinction between work and labor, helps understand for her the way that labor is about life and is about this metabolism with nature, and that it is completely alienated from the world. It doesn't have any worldliness to it. Work, on the other hand, is really one of the core insights for her idea of worldliness, that we build this humanly fabricated world. And so in section 18, called The Durability of the World, she just sort of expresses it in some of these core ideas. The first one being durability, right? Lastingness, stability. The world, she says, has the function of stabilizing life. These are, I think, things that a lot of people would throw away, but for her, they're very important. And, in our modern technological world, where the generations move faster and faster, where the world changes, what she says is, we need, as human beings, we need a stable world. We need a home. And this world is what she has in mind here, is largely fabricated by work. She has an etymology in footnote 1 on faber, homo faber, which means to make something, to fabricate. And so man as fabricator, man as maker, and he makes all sorts of things: objects of use, durable objects, stable objects, valuable objects, exchange objects. But all of these objects are distinguished by this idea that they, once we make them, they sort of stand out from us. We don't consume them again. And they look back at us. They are a Gegenstand, an object. They stand against us in the German. And in that relative independence, they form a kind of world. The German word Gegenstand, which stands against, which is the word for object, that's where these have objectivity. They stand against us. And that is what Arendt is interested in here. She's also quite aware, and she makes it clear, that there's a huge overlap between work and labor, and between use objects and objects of consumption. As I said before, even a house, one of the more durable objects, will decay and eventually be consumed. Not to mention that artworks can be hung on walls because we have a 5-foot space with a hole and we want to cover them and be used in that way, but they can also be destroyed and eventually recycled. So she's just very aware that these distinctions are fluid, and yet she is wanting to hold on to them. Section 19, I always do this with chapter sections, but section 19 of chapter 4 is on reification. Reification is a somewhat fancy word for thingification. Re is from the Latin res, which means thing. So it's the making of things. The point here is simply that what Homo faber, what man as a maker does, is he makes things, he fabricates. And there's a certain pride and strength which man takes in this fabrication. It's different from labor, in which it's pure violence. I mean, here there's a violence where you rip things from the world, but you're actually also making the world. And her point here, I think the key of this chapter, which is that in some way we fabricate, we reify in accord with a model, a paradigm, a paradigma, something that we see. In doing so, we make things that are in line with something out in the world, an idea, if you will, in the Platonic sense. And so, again, the idea is it doesn't come from ourselves, it comes from this idea, and it is, again, a kind of worldly endeavor. The two next chapters, and sort of I will say certainly two of the more difficult chapters in the book, and two of the more difficult chapters that we've read, on the instrument are a pair. They go together, which is why I gave you a little extra reading today to sort of fit them together. Section 20 is instrumentality and animal laborans, and section 21 is instrumentality and homo faber. What are these two chapters doing? On section 20, I'm sorry, instrumentality and animal laborans is really about the way in which we use instruments, right? Which instruments are made by homo faber. They're things of use that help us in the laboring process. And that as these instruments become more and more machine-like instead of hand tools. So, you can think about going from a hoe, a hand hoe, to a tiller, to maybe a robot, or a robotic, automatic tiller of the land of some sort. As you progress along this series of increasing automatic functioning, the instruments that we as animal laborans use become more and more automatic in such a way that we actually we create new machines and new tools for the other machines. The idea being here that increasingly the automated machines demand other automated machines, demand other robots, demand other pods, and that the world of labor, the instrumentality that we use becomes further and further separated from humanity and from human needs and human skills, even, and operability, such that some of these machines aren't even able to be operated by humans, but are operated by other machines. I mean, when I teach this, it's always, we spend a lot of time coming up with examples, but one simple one, is, you had coffee and you would filter the coffee into a thing, but then you have a coffee maker, and then you need filters for that and this and that. But then you have like these new Nespresso pods or whatever it is, whatever brand you use, and you need those little pods, and then you need the coffee that fits in the machines that fit the things into the pods, and you start developing machines really for other machines. Then she says it's no longer a question of whether man has become a servant to machines, right? That's not even really the issue. She says the question, and she raises this question on page 151. She says the question, therefore, is not so much whether we are the masters or slaves of our machines. This is near the bottom of 151, but whether machines will still serve the world and its things, or if, on the contrary, they and the automatic motion of their processes have begun to rule and even destroy world and things. So what she's asking here in this section on instrumentality and animal laborans is, insofar as we move from hand tools to electricity to automation, to what extent are these machines actually demanding other machines and other things, such that we no longer live in what she'll call a humanly created world, a humanly fabricated world. And so we live in a world that almost runs on itself and its needs based on things we've created. So one machine demands another, demands another, demands another. And increasingly, it destroys a world in the sense of a human world. The world becomes almost a world that answers to machines. So that on the next page, she'll say, in the middle of the page, right after footnote 17, as matters stand today, it has become as senseless to describe this world of machines in terms of means and ends as it has always been senseless to ask nature if she produced the seed to produce a tree, or the tree to produce the seed. We lose human control of this world of machines. They produce their needs, we answer their needs, and in an important way, the human world begins to recede. And so she'll continue in that same sentence, same section. By the same token, it is quite probable that the continuous process pursuant to the channeling of nature's never-ending processes into the human world, though it may very well destroy the world qua world as human artifice, will as reliably and limitlessly provide the species mankind with the necessities of life as nature herself did before. Namely, we will, in this new machine-like instrument, we will provide ever more of what we need. We'll be okay. We'll be alive. Animal laborans will be happy and living and metabolized with nature. But it's no longer with nature. It's now with a machine-built nature. But it's machine-built nature that is like nature, not human. And it grows of its own accord. She then, in this next chapter, raises the question of the homo faber and instrumentality, and what this instrumentality means for homo faber. So for homo faber, to be able to act instrumentally is to build a world, to have somehow and thus to escape the descent into mere labor or metabolism. That means we make things that have that are ends and that are, in some sense, stand apart from us as objects. But all these ends are also means, and since each end is a means, there's no end in itself. These ends don't actually have meaning. There is no meaning, and thus she says, in the world of homo faber, meaning is meaninglessness. The idea of any one of these things we produce having a meaning is meaningless. And this is, she says, the sort of paradox of all utilitarian thought and all utilitarian ages, that the only way out of it, the only way out of these world in which everything we produce as homo faber is meaningless, is the Kantian move, which is to posit man as the one end in itself that is always an end and not a means. That's the move that sort of moral philosophy makes to preserve meaningfulness in a utilitarian world. The problem with that move, Arendt is going to argue, is that in making man the measure of all things, we rob from the world all dignity, and we give it to man. It requires, she calls on page 157, the limitless devaluation of everything given. This is the way we often approach nature, but it is now also the way we increasingly engage with the things of the world. And so, the only way to save meaning in a world of instrumentality is to devalue the world and make man the center. We'll see in chapter 6 on the vita activa in the modern age that this is part and parcel of the philosophical and scientific attempt to respond to philosophical and scientific developments by making the world, which increasingly is meaningless and against us and can't be known and is thus foreign, bringing it into us, this process of interiorization that she's going to talk about in chapter 6. In some way, it's prepared for here in this chapter on instrumentality and homo faber. Okay. There's a lot of really rich details in these chapters. I'm interested to see what you guys make of them. And maybe I'll stop there and we'll open it up for questions. So the first, remember, you can engage in a chat. You can raise your hand. We'll try and go mostly in order. If there's a burning need to respond, let me know. But we'll go for the most part in order by using the hand raise function under the reactions bar, if you have the reactions bar at the bottom of your screen, if you're up to date on your version of Zoom. Bob, you're up.
Thank you. Got up at 4:30 this morning, given the short notice change of the schedule, and had to meet my other obligations. But I was astounded by number 20 here, and I do have a question. I was reminded of Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, and how, the machine and Charlie becomes a machine. And then I was thinking of Ray Kurzweil and his imaginative thinking about the future, in which kind of you download all your memories and you get a sort of a virtual human being. But the question is, and this is for Roger and anybody else, how does information technology and artificial intelligence, how does that come into play with Hannah Arendt's going from a tool to a machine to automation? And so does IT represent an even further chapter in this evolution? Or is it covered here by automation? Or is it something completely, beyond whatever it was she was contemplating? And of course, she wrote this, 60 years ago. So I guess at that point, there was very little, I think, in the way of artificial intelligence or information technology.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's an important question, and obviously, one that we've talked a lot about, and I'm interested in. So she'll make this distinction, between on page 147, between tools and machines, right? You can at least start there. And so about 2/3 of the way down the page, she says, the case of the machine is entirely different. Unlike the tools of workmanship, which at every moment in the work process remain the servants of the hand, right? So the pen remains the servant of the hands. Let's just use a very simple example. The machines demand that the laborer serve them and that he adjust the natural rhythm of his body to their mechanical movement. So if I'm going to type on my machine, first of all, I have to learn a QWERTY keyboard or not. And I have to, learn to, and I have, so I mean, we can, and then what are there other machines, dictation machines and others? What does it mean? I mean, it's an interesting question that the machines demand that the laborer serve them, that he adjusts the natural rhythm of his body to their mechanical movement. This certainly does not imply that men as such adjust to or become the servants of their machines, but it does mean that as long as the work of the machines lasts, the mechanical process has replaced the rhythm of the human body. So that's one level. Another level is when the machine is automatic and I have to keep up with it. Also, but when the machine is such that it demands, that I maybe type faster or do other things, and I have to, I don't know. I mean, I have to fit to its rhythm. But her overarching points that she wants to make, as we talked about, is that these machines begin to cut the human out. I mean, first they make the human conform to it, but increasingly, we need other machines to work with these machines, to work with these machines. And you bring up the example of IT or AI. And I don't know how many of you, I linked to it in the Amor Mundi newsletter about a month or so ago. I don't know. I don't remember. These things run together in my head. I don't know how many of you saw either what I wrote or the article about this, this lab at Princeton that is creating data analyses, I think for understanding, what was it? I don't know if it was planetary stuff or cosmological stuff, but usually, you collect data, the human puts it in and then writes a program and then analyzes the data. They are creating machines in which the data is collected and then data is organized and categorized and put out without any human interference and not even any human teaching the machine how to organize the data. The machine itself is using algorithms and using machine learning to analyze the data in ways that are more efficient than if a human had sought to analyze the data. And so the way they described it is, you, instead of going from data to human theory to data, you go from data to data and you cut the human out completely. This, I think, is, I don't know if Arendt ever conceived of that per se, but this is, I think, what she means, that as we increasingly allow machines to not only collect data, but analyze the data and even think about how to analyze the data, such that the theories are not even made by humans, but the theories are made by machines. We the instrumentality, the instruments become a kind of well, on the one hand, they destroy the human world because the human world, and one that we can understand, becomes increasingly less relevant, and they make their own world, which is a machine world. This doesn't mean that we are servants of them, but we live in a world that is increasingly dehumanized and mechanized. So, I think that's how I can respond to your question. I don't know if that helped, Bob, or if you want to follow up.
No, so you're putting the developments of IT and AI very much in the context of what Hannah Arendt was saying here. I was hoping there'd be some genius here who would see it as a total departure, representing an entirely new chapter, and could explain why, just as she saw, the development from the tool to the machine to automation to eliminating the human being. So, is there anything beyond eliminating the human being?
Well, I think.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah. Who's that?
Sorry, this is Ben Holmes. So this is my field. I work in AI. And I think, honestly, like the way Roger was describing it, I think as an extension of what she's talking about here seems right on to me. The sort of tension in the field right now is kind of the old way of developing a machine learning model was to sit down with an expert, get an idea of what you should look at, what inputs to give an algorithm, and then look at the outputs. And the tension, as I say, is that's almost always in every situation outperformed by just kind of letting the machine decide, do what's called unsupervised learning, where you just say, here's all the data, find me groupings or find a way to classify. And it performs very well, but the real downside is the feature set that it ends up training on is rarely human comprehensible. It's training on associations of features 3 or 4 layers deep that are hard to visualize and very hard to describe. And so you end up with decision-making engines that do really well, but you're not entirely sure why. So if there's a change, is that going to completely screw up the system? We don't know. We do know it works well, but for things like medical decisions, which is the specific field I'm in right now, like you see the real like ache of that. And I think what always strikes me about Hannah Arendt is how early she was writing and like anticipating this. But like no one wants a machine that says, we've decided to not do the surgery because it's too risky. And the reason is here's 80 pages of linear algebra. It just is, but the question is, as we go on, will there be more acceptance of that? Are people going to get used to the idea that this thing knows better than we do in the face of evidence that it looks like it does, but we have to surrender the idea that we can comprehend why or not? And it's not entirely clear to me which one of those is the right way. So it's really interesting.
If someone can find the Princeton, the piece I wrote about the Princeton thing or about the Princeton thing, it's actually an excellent article. I can put it in the chat. People might find it of interest. It was on the Amor Mundi about a month ago, or maybe a little more than a month ago. But I think what Ben said is really right and helpful. I mean, this is part of what Arendt meant by the dehumanization of the world, which she thought, what's interesting, people say, oh, you're saying she saw this so far in advance. I mean, she saw this starting with Plato, right? She says that as soon as we begin making the world, we, on the one hand, humanize it, but as soon as we as soon as the scientific revolution happens, we are already starting to mathematize the world. We're starting to see the world as a series of as a truth that's beyond human language and explainable human language and comprehension. This goes way back. And so one of the reasons she's able to see things that seem prophetic is because she's not looking at, machines and automation. She's looking at machines and automation as part of a philosophical and cultural shift away from um, a, a humanly, linguistically constructed world to a scientifically constructed world. And so automation and then IT are simply outgrowths of that abstracted nature of the world as she understands it. It all comes out of the Leibnizian formula, nothing is without a reason. Nihil est sine ratione in Latin. This was for her the beginning of the world alienation and scientific revolution. And if nothing is without a reason, everything that has a reason, nothing is without a reason. That means without a reason, it doesn't exist. And these reasons become increasingly complicated and increasingly unknowable for humans. And this leads to a deep doubt about the world for her. So this is sort of the background and the depth of the way she understands these issues that Ben, I think, really helpfully expressed. James.
Hey, Roger. I'm going to bring the discussion all the way from logarithms up to shit.
Great.
And I don't think it's irrelevant. To the world of the Bonusik, is that what's correct?
What?
The Bonusik?
Yeah.
Bonusik?
Yeah.
The Philistine?
Mm-hmm.
I'm here. A little story about a guy named Wayne Thiebaud. I'm putting his name up on the chat right now. He's a painter. He's 100 years old. He lives in Mesa, Arizona. And he sold a painting a few years ago for 8.4 million. He just sold one for 16.5 million. And I saw him talk in California, and he told a story as to how he likes to teach. He likes to teach beginning painting students because he feels that painting is about changing people's thinking. I mean, and teaching is about changing people's thinking. And what he does in his first class is he paints a painting in front of the class. So they get to see the process evolve, just the way we see our thinking evolve in this class. At the end of the class, he picks up one of these.
What is that of?
A big spatula.
Spatula, yeah.
And he scrapes the whole painting onto the spatula, and he flings it across the room into a garbage can with great pride and says, "Do you know how long it took me to learn how to do this?" I would love your Hannah Arendt comment on that. All the elements are here. We're high technology, making art, the Philistine, the caca, the process of teaching. It's all in this little fairy tale story. That is true.
It's a great story. What to
Last
say?
week, Ken talked about how he had consumerism. Consumerism had entered his life in relationship to what we were talking about with Hannah Arendt last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I just this reading group has affected the way I work as an artist and an actor profoundly. I can feel spaces opening up in my mind and my heart, and I just felt that my understanding of what Thibault's did here is just something that's relevant to what we do here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I'm not sure how it fits with instrumentality, but I think it's relevant because I think what Thibault is doing is thinking um and acting. Um uh he's performing for his
Can, can,
students.
can I just say that it's a really perfect illustration of materiality and objectification and transformation. And I think she talks about all those things. I think that's just a fabulous physical illustration of that.
Okay, it's a physical illustration of making something and then destroying it.
No, it's not about the something. It's about the material that stands in for the something that we infuse or project onto it. So it's about actual transformation of how, and sort of nothingness, somethingness and nothingness. Because when he flings it as shit on a spatula across a room, it's no longer a painting. If he left it in any way on a surface, on any surface that we could decide is a painting, we would be projecting meaning onto it. So
Right.
That's how it illustrates transformation and objectification for me.
Yeah, she's going to talk about this, and what it makes me think of is the poem by Rilke that she talks about in the chapter on the work of art on page 168, which is about reification and thingification. And we can get there in a couple of weeks, but we might look at it. It's the poem Magic, which Rilke writes, and it's and the key lines of in art, the the dust becomes flame, it becomes magic, it's made into beauty. um and and um and in a sense what Thibault is doing is magic in making the painting and then undoing it, and bringing it back to matter and the material, as far as I understand it. And he's, I take it, I'm Vivian, I mean, I defer to both of you as artists, James and Vivian, but I think the idea is to make them aware of this magical process of transformation and reification, and to make them understand that it's on the one hand magical and thoughtful, and yet it's something you have to learn to do in some way as a craft. I don't know, I mean, how he would do that or why
it's not so much about the magic. It could be, but I don't think that he's demonstrating that most strongly. I think what he's demonstrating is that we do people forget all the time when they, for example, look at a painting. They forget that they're looking at a painting. They mistake the things they think they see for the thing itself. And that flinging or transforming of the material illustrates the thingness completely. So that's what I think it demonstrates most strongly.
You see, I think to me, this demonstrates the Buddhist concept of attachment. That, to me, is what he's demonstrating to the students, that you create this object and you become attached to the object, and then you destroy the object and you let go of it and you start again. And so if you're going to learn, you have to not attach yourself to that object as it exists in its first appearance. So I don't really see the Arendtian connection here particularly.
Thank you for your patience.
I think Carol also makes a point in the chat. I'm just looking at it about that it's not only magic, it's also a lifetime of skill and developing skill. I took that to be some part of what he's trying to teach beginning painting students as well. I think that's right. But yeah, I mean, it's a great example. It's a great story. Thank you, James, for
Thank you.
I actually have always loved Wayne Thibault's work, so it's nice to hear somebody talking about him. It's been someone I've always enjoyed very much, so thank you. Stephen.
Thanks, Roger. You might want to get your spatula out for what I'm about to say.
Uh-oh.
I have two questions. One I have a little more investment in, and the other not so much. So you could not spend a lot of time on either, or at least not on one of them. I want to come to the defense of farmers. When Arendt says that tilling the soil is not an example of labor transforming itself into work, I'm paraphrasing here, I think, as cultivating land is not an object. If it were, it would require only preservation. And I guess that would make it like a artifact or a thing or an object in her reasoning. And she says the land needs repeated labor. But I would claim that the farmer is, if he has to be or she has to be both animal laborans, is equally homo faber, in that the farmer is not only doing those physical actions to pertain to the life cycle of the earth and its products, but is hopefully leaving a legacy which is intangible, but is still kind of institutional. And I guess I'm trying to follow Wendell Berry and other thinkers of the agrarian type. And I'm wondering if any other folks in our group here felt a little bit uneasy about Arendt's treatment of tilling the soil. That's my more serious question. The other one is about the instrumentality chapter. I think Arendt is saying that Plato aligns with her, that the instrumentalizer, the person who instrumentalizes, is not man the speaker and doer, or man the thinker to whom the world is being related. But I want to ask, are there three different types of men, or are there three functions of men, such that one man in his day could perform all three, like Shakespeare's man playing many roles in his lifespan? So that's my less seriously invested question. The other one about tilling the soil, I'm a little more concerned about.
By the three, you mean labor, work, and action, or you have something else in mind, Stephen, just so I understand it?
Is it the case that there's an animal laborans, that's one type of man, there's a homo faber, that's another one, and then there's the thinker, doer, actor, that's yet a third? I want to ask whether all those are just simply functions that perhaps one person can be involved in his or her life.
Well, just that's an easy question to answer, and the answer is yes. I mean, she would never say that there's that one person is a laborer and one person is a homo faber and one person is a thinker. She thinks these are faculties of the human condition, and all humans have the capacity for all of them and others. So if that's your question, that's an easy one to answer. On that,
we disposed of that one. Excellent, thanks.
So the question about tilling, I love how we get talking about things like this, is, so she raises this in this first section of the work chapter, as a way of acknowledging, on the first hand, that the distinction between labor and work is one that is difficult, and it overlaps. So she says at the top of the bottom of the last page to the next, so on 137 to 138, she says, although use and consumption, like work and labor, are not the same, they seem to overlap in certain important areas to such an extent that the unanimous agreement with which both public and learned opinion have identified these two different matters seems well justified. Use does contain an element of consumption, right? And consumption is going to have an element of use. Used, and then the end of this end of that paragraph, used or unused, they will remain in the world for a certain while until they are wantonly destroyed. So all used things become consumption, consumable. A similar and more famous and much more plausible argument can be raised in favor of the identification of work and labor. So this is where you're coming in. And she says, what's the one thing that seems closest to labor? The tilling of the soil. Now, like you, she's now going to complicate this, right? She's going to say, actually, the tilling of the soil actually is not, has an element of durability to it. So she'll say she'll say it leaves some product behind which outlasts its own activity and forms a durable addition to the human artifice. The same task performed year in and year out will eventually transform the wilderness into cultivated land. So in that sense, she's agreeing with you that tilling has a kind of worldly element in which it produces something, namely cultivated land. And she says, yet despite this, right, and despite the time-honored dignity of agriculture, arises from the fact that the tilling of the soil not only procures means of subsistence, but in the process prepares the earth for the building of the world. Even in this case, the distinction remains quite clear. The cultivated land is not, properly speaking, a use object, which is there in its own durability and requires for its permanence no more than ordinary care and preservation. The tilled soil, if it is to remain cultivated, needs to be labored upon time and again. So whereas a house, once built, it sits there. It may decay over years, but it doesn't need to be every year retilled or every fall or every season. Whereas the tilled soil, she says, every season needs to be retilled. And that's sort of how she puts it into the laboring as opposed to the working category. But again, I've tried to say this ad infinitum over the last few months. Do not put too much effort into making these distinctions hard and fast. She's not trying to in any way, just like she's not trying to say that there's one man who's a laborer and one is a worker and one is an actor. She's not trying to say there's one activity that's labor and one activity that's work. And the same activity can be all three.
That's good, Roger. I guess I can't get used to the idea of distinctions that are kind of quasi distinctions, that they're slippery, or I think, as you said before, they're fluid. That's a little hard for me to get used to, but I'll keep trying.
Yeah, I mean, so the question that you can ask is, why does she make these distinctions if she's going to admit that they're fluid? Mm-hmm. She doesn't make them like an analytic philosopher does, or like a categorizing scientist does, to divide the world. Yeah. She makes them to make things visible.
Yeah.
So she wants us to see labor as that which is that part of human activity and part of human life, which is about keeping us alive and about metabolism with nature, in which and that part of what we do is simply laboring. And she wants us to see work, which is part of what we do, is make cultivated land and make work objects and make art and action. And she wants to see it. These distinctions are there to make important things visible, not to be hard and fast distinctions.
I will say, if I can jump in just real quick, because I have spent a fair amount of time both in agrarian context theologically and ecologically. What I think is interesting about this distinction is that now I would say the cultivation of land and soil in particular has actually become more of a kind of work, I feel like, because it is because the world has become more consumable. You know, like there is a quite durable art to the creation of soil, precisely because we don't have soil like we had 50 years ago, and that's worldwide. So there's an environmental and an ecological sort of change there that, as I was reading that, I was thinking, like, if I can agree with her, sort of like that we're progressing towards more consumption, but that has actually turned something like soil, which maybe used to be more a product of labor, is actually, I feel like now much more a product of work, because it has to be, you know, like there is an art, and soil has to be made durable, because as it is in the world, it's not very useful, not just in the wilderness, but in cultivated fields, the soil is not very useful. So that's just an interesting, like, kind of switch up to me in a way, just from her, like, very specific example.
Thank you, Kath. I think Catherine, right? Yeah. That's an interesting point. I mean, you know, we had a conference a few years ago at the Arendt Center on the gut and on what's it called? You know, the microbiome and you know, there's a way in which, I mean, and you know, the other prime example of consumption versus, you know, versus work is production of food, right? Food is to eat and thus to consume. It doesn't last. And yet, you know, there's also fine food and fine eating in which yes, you eat it, but the image lasts. Sometimes you take pictures of it. You put it on Instagram or whatever it is. You know, there even eating and even consuming food, it can be a kind of work that has some durable, lasting elements to it. We remember special meals and special things we ate, things of that sort. So I think that's right. Building a living soil that is not to be consumed, but actually preserved, so that we can continue to grow real food in it, is the kind of thing that's like cultivation that she's talking about. But as she says, you have to do it over and over again. That soil needs to constantly be cultivated. You know, these things move back and forth, and I think it's important. You know, I think it's helpful to see that. So thank you. Jeff G.
Hi. Okay. I don't think it was next, but yeah, I had a couple. For me, the most interesting chapter was the reification chapter, actually. So I had a couple questions from there. One of them was short and easy. The other one's about the very end. It's a little more diffuse. The easy part, well, I don't know if it's easy, but it was clarifying this idea that only the first artifact manufactured should be considered work. That I think that might simplify some of the things that have been sticking people, right? This idea that basically and then nowadays with automation being, you know, pretty much almost perfected, you know, that becomes really clear that just having cranking out a bunch of artifacts is no longer work. And not to mention they're usually disposable. The second part, the harder part, is the very end where she talks about fabrication process is not irreversible. In other words, it is reversible. And maybe it's reversible because we destroy the things, or maybe it's reversible because, well, I don't know. It's tied up with this idea of mastery, and so we've been fixated in most of our sessions on like the hierarchy of the laboring and the working and the action, which we haven't really studied yet, but. It occurs to me though that Homer Faber is the most mental, and his operations are abstract, whereas the laborer and the actor are not. And I wonder if so we're sort of maybe we're favoring, we the audience is favoring modern that because modern computer work, right, it's very design focused and abstract. We make a thing and we can take the design away, and we want to give that a priority, but somehow that isn't that's not where she wants us to end up, because it sort of forgets our, well, I would say our physical nature, that's sort of the labor, but it also forgets our being in the world, which I think is going to point to the action. That basically it's not enough to have where we're master is the master of things that are sort of in the air. They're not real. They're not grounded. Does that make sense? Like I said, that part was not as well formulated, but that seemed to be more at the heart of it.
I think it's an interesting idea that you say that work is the most, I forget how you put it, intellectual of the three. And I think that's probably right. Insofar as work is the one most closely related to the idea, right? The idea that comes first, the Platonic eidos, or the thing one sees with one's mind's eye. And at the end, when she says that everything produced by human hands can be destroyed by them, and no use object is so urgently needed in the life process that its maker cannot survive and afford its destruction. Homo faber is indeed a lord and master, not only because he is the master or has set himself up as the master of all nature, but because he is master of himself and his doings. This is true neither of anima laborans, which is subject to the necessity of its own life, nor of the man of action who remains dependent on his fellow men. So, I mean, I think you're right. In a way, Homo faber is the one who must know what he's going to make, have an idea of it, and make it. And in that way, it is the most intellectual of the three capacities that she's talking about. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying. I think it is.
That actually does help a lot. Just saying it and hearing you read the right the right quotation really helped quite a bit. But it makes it to put a finer point on it. It seems to me that basically maybe the reason we're preferring work is because work is where we have that sense of mastery. So it's sort of self-serving psychologically, right? That we like this idea where we're in charge. Whereas the world of action, we've been sort of saying that, okay, well, someone who attains a certain position and has a certain political sway is in charge. But as anybody who's been president keeps saying, is like, you realize you're not in charge. You have to deal with so many other people. But where we really do have control is in these design type situations where we're impressing the eidos over and over again. So yeah, I think that settles it.
Ahmed Talib, if you don't mind, could you explain what you say when you say what I just said speaks to James Kybert's story? Because I'm not sure I see that, but it's an interesting point. Are you here, Ahmed? Do you mind doing that?
Oh, I typed it in the chat. Well, I said, mastering the self is developing skill is mastering the self as much as it is mastering material, and that also allows you to throw away the thing that you just produced, because it's not about the material at the end. It's about the skill and mastering the skill, and that's sort of illustrated to the students by doing that.
It's an interesting point, although, I mean, for Homo faber, it is about producing something in the end. But it's an interesting point. I thank you. I hope you don't mind me calling you out. I just saw it in the chat. I wanted to hear it. That's good. Thank you. I also.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You want to speak to that, Tara?
Yeah, I mean, my question was about basically Jeff's point, which is that I felt like Arendt earlier really wanted to challenge Marx's categories of mental and material labor, and that she did it through the categories of work and labor, where she says that, oh, even mental work, even mental tasks can be actually labor. And so I also felt that her distinguishing feature to work was a type of premeditation, that it was the act of designing, it was the act of planning and charting, so that the one who builds the machine is the craft person, and then anyone who works the machine is the laborer. Or if I design a chair, someone else can build it. But if I build a chair from someone else's design, I'm just a laborer. And so what my question was, that I don't quite see this distinction really holding, because I can't really think of a category of mental labor that isn't ultimately about repetition of the body. And so I don't think that she quite divides mental from material labor. So I just wanted to throw that in because it followed, I think, some of Jeff's impetus, and I found that to be the most distinguishing feature.
Where does she talk about the difference between mental and material labor? I mean, that's Marx you're saying, but where does she talk about that?
Earlier on in labor, when she starts it out, when she's saying, you know, she almost makes a joke out of it. She says, oh, you know, Marx wants us to think that thinking is one type of labor, and physical work is another type of labor, but they're both labor. Okay. So that's in the beginning of labor. And so I felt like this was a real attempt to rethink those categories, and that she wanted to be able to even put mental activity into a laboring category, but I can't actually think of an example of that. So I just wanted to throw that out there while we were still on this topic.
Right. I'd have to go back. I mean, I think the idea is that for it to be work, it has to end up with some object at the end. And most thinking for her has no object.
See, I read her as saying that it's the design that is the work. I don't know if anyone else thought that was really the distinguishing feature, was that one had to imagine what was going to appear even before one made it, whether it was just the idea or it was an elaborate plan, but it was the act of imagining really that distinguishes work. That was my reading of it. I guess that's my question, but maybe it's one that we need to all kind of like reconsider.
Let's take a look at this. This is going to be on, I think, if I understand what you're talking about, page 140 to 141. And I know how you need to ask your questions soon. I'll try and get to you.
Thanks.
So on 140 to 141, she says, let's see what I can do here with this long paragraph. The actual work of fabrication is performed under the guidance of a model in accordance with which the object is constructed. So there's the guidance of the model, and then there's the construction of the object. Now, if I understand Tara's point, the guidance of the model is sort of the intellectual work, and the construction of the object would be what she's calling labor, but I'm not Arendt, but Tara. I'm not sure I concur, but we'll see. This model can be an image beheld by the eye of the mind, or a blueprint in which the image has already found a tentative materialization through work. So in the model, held by the mind, the eye of the mind, there's a tentative materialization through work. So one aspect of work is, I think, what Tara was saying, which is the sort of tentative materialization in an image. In either case, I think that means in both cases. Let's see. What guides the work of fabrication is outside the fabricator and precedes the actual work process in much the same way as the urgencies of the life process within the laborer precede the actual labor process. So that the model, which is a kind of tentative materialization through work, is what guides the actual work, which is the making of the thing in line with the model. I'm going to skip the long parentheses on psychology and say what claims our attention is the veritable gulf that separates all bodily sensations, pleasure or pain, desires and satisfaction, from mental images which lend themselves so easily and naturally to reification that we neither conceive of making a bed without first having some image, some idea of a bed before our inner eye, nor can imagine a bed without having recourse to some visual experience of a real thing. So, I mean, I think, for her, while there's sort of like a tentative work or materialization in the image or the idea, which originally has some sort of experience of a real thing behind it, she says, the actual work is actually the building of the thing or the making of the thing. Okay, does that help, Tara?
Yeah, I think I'm just kind of going to be thinking about that quality. And I also think that section about, this is a really sort of provocative section, that these bodily sensations are so private that they cannot even be adequately voiced, much less represented in the outside world. I think our feminist reading group, which is happening on Sunday at 11 a.m. If anyone would like to join us, let me know. Many of you have signed up. I think we'll take up these very questions of can, in fact, the body and its desires be represented in a public space?
Yeah, I mean, she talked about that in a couple of weeks ago. We talked about pain and the way that pain can or cannot be represented. So yes, there is a feminist Arendt reading group that is breaking off out of this one, led by Tara and Susan, and you're welcome to write to them if you want to be part of that. Okay, Robert, can I recognize Hal and then you, just so that he gets his question in? He's got to go. All right, Hal, you're going to go first, and then Robert.
Yeah, what I have to go is that I have to also be on another call, so I can still watch the chat in the background. But my question is related to the construction of basically and the creation of these work towards building things that aren't necessarily physical, but are institutions. I mean, one example would be the Hannah Arendt Center itself, like not talking about the reading group, but like the center or organization like an NGO or something like that. Because obviously there's such a thing as the NGO building, but I don't think it would be really possible to say that Greenpeace is either like a government or it's also not something like a chess club.
So you're asking about institutions or states or
well wouldn't Arendt probably argue that states or governments are like on a different level because of beliefs of democracy versus like an institution, like again like an NGO or something? I mean, that's a good example.
Well, I think the old
construction of something, but then that's also like a community in its own way. I don't know, that because it's something that lasts and it's something we build in a certain sense, but it's not like physically built.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of Burkhart's claim that the state is a work of art. And I think that Arendt, who certainly reads Burkhart well, would agree with that. And I think that one could say that many institutions are in meaningful ways works. they're things made that are created. They can decay and be consumed, or they can last. And the public world is comprised of things made by human hands, which includes computers and tables and pens, but also books and artworks and institutions. So, I think without a doubt that for her, the public world and states and institutions are works. They're, yeah. I mean, I don't think there's much doubt to me about that. I'm not sure why you would doubt it, Hal.
It's not so much that I was doubting it. It's just that throughout all of this, you were mostly discussing a lot of like physical manufacturing of things. Because I know last night, we had a breakout ring group with some of us. We were discussing the physical building of like a table versus like the actual institution of maybe people sitting around a table and having like a group associated with that lasts and meets for maybe generations even.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense, but I think institutions. I mean, again, I'm trying to think if she ever talks about institutions in this chapter, and off the top of my head, I don't remember it, but I'll have to look. But I would think of institutions without a doubt as works for her. They're part of the stability of the world. Okay, Robert.
Yeah, I had two questions. One is a question about vocabulary. In this chapter, she uses several terms: tool, instrument, implement, machine, and in a section we haven't gotten to yet, device. These all seem to have something to do with each other, but they don't equally well apply to everything, as a produced means to an end, or whatever she would speak of in general terms. So I'm wondering, is there systematic distinction between these things? That's the first question. Second one is kind of philosophical. In her takedown of utilitarianism, she talks about Kant's introduction of the notion of an end in itself. And she complains that that is paradoxical or self-contradictory. But a little bit later, when she says, the Greeks, this is very bottom of page 156, the Greeks in their classical period declared the whole field of the arts and crafts, where men work with instruments, to do something not for its own sake, but in order to produce something else, to be benausic, a term perhaps best translated by Philistine. Okay, but if she's indicating, as I think she is, that speech, at least action, possible speech, are unlike Potter's benausic characteristic. It's something pursued for its own sake. Well, for its own sake, like end in itself, it's a self-referential notion. And any such idea is going to be paradoxical or contradictory. if you look at it the right way. Take God, for example. So I'm not sure that I agree with their argument here. Okay, that's the second question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. On the first question, about the sort of the way these different terms relate to each other. I haven't done a full, I haven't sat down and tried to do it. So I'll do this off the top of my head. A tool, right? Partakes of the general idea of instrumentality. Again, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So, if I get it wrong, shoot me.
But it has to be something held in your hand.
Yes,
say.
but it has to be something held in your hand. I don't know what an implement is. I think an implement is a tool. I have not thought about that connection. Machine, is the big distinction she's trying to make between tools and machines. And whereas a tool remains a servant in the hand, the machine demands the laborers serve them, that he adjusts to the natural rhythm of his body, to their mechanical movement. She has this wonderful footnote about Charlie Chaplin. About Carl Bucher, but Bob, gave us the Chaplin reference about songs and rhythms of laborers. But machines, do it in a different way. They make us come to their thing. And as the machines become more and more dominant and powerful, they, in a sense, destroy a human world and create a machine world. So that a tool maker who invented tools to build a human world, to help human life, now we have machines which are actually building a world which is inhuman. I don't know the word device. It's not a word that is technical for her. The word that she uses in this chapter that we've come across a couple times, and that I will tell you to be on the lookout for, is process. The word process is going to become one of the most important words, not only in this book, but in all of her work. And I will say that it's one of those words in Arendt that I think is, on the one hand, incredibly important and yet a bit unthought at times in my understanding. Let me rephrase that. My attempt to think it has been unthought to the extent it should be. It is an important aspect of her work. And when we get to chapter 6, the process character of the world is going to become one of the dominant themes of the book. And it's not an accident that it shows up in this chapter in her talking about machines. The process character of the world is going to connect to the way in which we increasingly think in inhuman ways, by inserting new processes into the world that overtake nature, just like machines overtake the world and nature. And so there's going to be a connection. So that would be if I were to, not device, but if I were to put another word in there, it would be process, and worth us thinking about. On your second, that's what I can do on the words. On the second question, about Kant and the Greeks, let me see if I can parse this for me and you. So the problem, the Kantian problem, just so we all understand it, is that in a world in which we, as Homo faber, produce things, we produce a pen, it's an end. But of course, the pen has a means to write. And so the pen has no end in itself. Its end is for other things. And so if everything is an end, everything is also a means, there's no highest end. And Kant's attempt is to say, well, there must be a highest end, namely that they're all for man, to make man the center. And Robert points us to 156 and 157, where she talks about the fact that the Greeks had contempt for sculptors, those who made things, produced something else, banausics, or Philistines, which is how she translates it. I'm not sure if that's correct. And she says in the next paragraph, the issue at stake is, of course, not instrumentality, right? It's not that they produce something, because everyone produces something, but the use, not instrumentality, the use of means to achieve an end, but rather the generalization of the fabrication experience, which usefulness and utility are established as the ultimate standards for life and the world of men. The problem with Banausic is that if it's useful, it's good. This generalization, she says, is inherent in the activity of Homo faber, because the whole idea of Homo faber is that you produce things that are useful, and that is good. The instrumentalization of the whole world and the earth, right? This is the Homo faber idea, this limitless devaluation of everything given, this process of growing meaninglessness where every end is transformed into a means and which can be stopped only by making man himself the Lord and master of all things, does not directly arise out of the fabrication process. The point is that this problem of Homo faber and of utilitarianism can only be stopped by making man the master. And that's what she thinks Kant has done.
No way.
So Robert, what's the problem? Maybe I'm missing your question.
The problem is that Aristotle, in describing virtuous action, also says virtuous actions have to be done for their own sake.
Oh, right. I remember now your question. Yeah. So the difference is that in this is within the realm of work, which is an instrumental and utilitarian idea. In action, right, which is what Aristotle is talking about, there's no end. Actions don't have an end product. They don't have, when I make a speech, my action doesn't have an end of the speech. That's the work. The action is an unending process. And so there's no problem of producing an end that's useful. The action doesn't have to be useful. I can just do it because I want to, or I can do it because I moved to do it. And there's no actual, I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word actual. There's no means ends. The means ends criteria are not the ultimate criteria of action. The only criteria that you can measure action by, she's going to say, is greatness. Do people recognize it as worthy of attention? And that's going to be the difference. So action doesn't fit on this means ends thing, and it doesn't have this problem.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. John Stern. Is John here?
Yeah. I just couldn't find myself. Thank you. This sort of follows up on this previous comment or thought, but she keeps assaulting my natural inclination to be optimistic, going all the way back to the prologue. in the sense that she posits for us part of the human condition, the onset of the atomic age, and simultaneously the space age, which is both are maturing quite rapidly over the last 60 years. And simultaneously, where she now on page, as we've been discussing, she comes to the Kantian point of view that man is the essence, and or if I have it correctly, man is the end in itself, in himself. And we're now entering an age where we're learning that machines are more productive, can be more productive, full, aware than we ever were as human beings, and the ability to divine outcomes. And so I'm led with the thought that I see a parallel. For centuries, we used to think that the earth went around the sun, or the earth was the center, and everything resolved about ourselves. And I'm constantly being led to the conclusion, well, man had this presumption, this arrogance that we are the center. And we're slowly disturbingly discovering we're not. And we see it in our actions to other members of the species. We don't treat each other very well in the main. Somehow we've fortunately survived. So I keep getting stuck on the point that this is to be an Arendtian is you're led down a path of despair and and negativism, and that the ultimate conclusion that one can come to, yeah, it would be great to come back 200 years from now and see ourselves as a new species, which I imagine we will be. So it's really not a question, it's more of a editorial comment, and I'll leave it like that.
It was all worth it because of your opening, which said that she assaults your natural inclination to optimism, which I thought was great. Of course, Arendt also is the thinker of the love of the world and natality, and the idea that we should never despair, because the great truth of humanity is that we're free to start anew and to build things anew and make things anew. And so, this is a woman who lived through the rise of Hitler, imprisonment, putting in a concentration camp, statelessness, totalitarianism, and yet somehow insisted that we love the world and have optimism that human freedom will always in some way reconstitute a new world. So I hear you. There's a lot of Arendt that can be one of the things that I think she's uniquely adept at is looking without rose-colored glasses at the world and seeing what she sees and judging it and not flinching. And, sometimes people like that, like when she writes about the human condition, and sometimes people really don't like it when she writes about, Eichmann and Jewish collaborators, or about what she saw as the attempt in Little Rock to move beyond social equality to a kind of beyond political equality to a kind of social equality. She has a way of really upsetting people and seeing and saying things that to her are what is, but other people find wrong. But what's amazing about her, I think, is that she doesn't ever write from a point of despair. I don't think there's any essay she ever wrote that's written from a point of despair. And that doesn't mean you can't read it from a point of despair if that's what you'd like, but that's not where she writes it from. She always writes as saying, the only way to actually reconstitute a human world is to think clearly and deeply about the way it's threatened, not to go back to the way it was, but to open up the possibilities for new actions that will make it anew. And that's what this book is about, to think what we are doing with the hope that in thinking about it, new people, new actions will come along that will make something new.
I always love at the conclusion of Asimov's Foundation, his wonderful trilogy, the redeeming grace was man's adaptability. And I always thought that was a hallmark for us. It's not that I despair what Arendt is saying. She really is candid and sort of lays it out as she sees the human condition. It just means, for me, the conclusion I come to, either we adapt or morph or metastasize into a different species with inputs of chips or something else, but we now have, as you say, we have the means of our disposal to destroy ourselves, but at the simultaneous to leave the environment that we destroy.
Yeah, and those are choices we have. I thank you. I mean, I think you're right. I'm gonna move on because we're got 20 minutes left. Scott, welcome back, Scott. You got to unmute yourself. Can you unmute?
Hey, Roger, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I guess Happy New Year's is in order.
Yeah.
I would like to offer up a concrete example of how the human condition of work has changed over the last century, and it might speak to the dehumanization of artifice, with an example and a really short reading that supports that. I have three friends who over the last 4 or 5 years have restored old homes. And the one thing, when they gutted the homes, two of them found newspapers that the construction worker put like as a time capsule per se. One was from 1917, and it was during the First World War. And just as an aside, one of the articles was from concerned mothers not sending their sons off to the World War. But then another one of my friends had a similar newspaper that was kind of time capsulated within the walls. And then a third person whose home was built in 1887, one of the construction workers left a really neatly placed nickel brand, and it was appraised at like, he had it appraised for like $600. So the reason I'm bringing that up was it seems as the quality of things were made back then. There was an expectation of durability, but at the same time, they realized it would be durable long enough so that when the time encapsulated objects were found, that it would be in the future. The reason that I'm bringing that up was, I'm not sure if you've read this little gem of a book by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit.
Yeah.
Have you read that?
I haven't read the whole thing, but I read excerpts. Okay. Yeah.
Well, the reason I bring that up, and I would like to see how this relates.
Of course, if I've read the book, I'm supposed to say, of course I've read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it can be read in 45 minutes. It's just a little pamphlet, but it's a gem. And what he does is in this book on bullshit is he is trying to, he basically posits that there's nothing more prevalent today than the prevalence of bullshit. And so he wants to, his goal is to find out, to come up with a theory on what bullshit is. And one of the things that he did is he relates a story about how Wittgenstein was very perturbed by a friend who came in and said she was sick as a dog. And he just found that unbelievable because, like, how do you know how a dog feels? How do you know what a sick of a dog is? You've never been a dog, or whatever. So how that relates to the whole construction work and durability thing is he reads here, says, and this is just really short, Wittgenstein once said that the following bit of verse by Longfellow could serve him as a motto. In the elder days of art, builders wrought with the greatest care, each minute and unseen part, for the gods are everywhere. The point of these lines is clear. In the old days, craftsmen did not cut corners. They worked carefully and they took care with every aspect of the work. Every part of the product was considered and each was designed and made to be exactly as it should be. These craftsmen did not relax their thoughtful self-discipline, even with respect to features of the work that would ordinarily not be visible. Although no one would notice if these features were not quite right. The craftsmen would be bothered by their conscious, so nothing was swept under the rug, or one might perhaps also say there was no bullshit. I just feel that fits into what we're talking about, but I'm not really sure how, or if you can point, or if anybody else can kind of weave some of Arendt's thoughts in. The thing that strikes me is clearly how artifice in terms of has been commodified down to, like, throwing up a house in 20 days, or the expectations of how long something would last. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Wonderful story about your friends and what they found. So there's a lot in there that I think is I agree with, and I think fits well. The certainly the move from durability, which fits well with the move from property to wealth, which we were talking about a few weeks ago. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah, it said my internet was unstable for a second. The move from property to wealth, and there's no doubt that more and more of what we make is designed to last less and less time, whether it's modern houses versus older houses, or pens. I mean, you don't make, more and more people use disposable pens or disposable masks or disposable computers or whatever it is. And that fits with the fact that more of the things we encounter in the world are closer to being consumables than to works. And so I think that's true, and it's part of what she's going to talk about as the reversal, the elevation of the anima laborans over and above the homo faber in the modern age. So yeah, I think it fits. One thing that I thought about when you were saying it is, I was just teaching David Graeber's book on the utopia of rules last week, and he has this great it's about bureaucracy, and he has this great riff on birth certificates, and he talks about how his grandfather's birth certificate from like the late 19th century in I think Cincinnati was this ornate birth certificate with like, you know, seals and colors and this and that. And then his father's was, you know, a sort of simple whatever. And then his was just like typescript in a little mimeograph machine, which is what mine looks like as well. And David Graeber and I, who unfortunately just died a few months ago, are about the same age. You know, and you had said that, or I think you were quoting Frankfurt in saying that we had moved from sort of this sort of craftsmanship to a kind of bad craftsmanship, you know. And look, we can all talk about theories of decline, but I actually don't know if that's the way I would put it. I would put it from a kind of craftsmanship that had multiple values, including not only durability, but also beauty and worldliness and making a statement, to increasingly craftsmanship that's simply rational and efficient. I mean, I think that today, you know, again, we can always have exceptions, but I think most bridges are built quite safely today. They're just built according to standards of rationality and efficiency, not about beauty often. And they're not meant to make a statement. I mean, except in rare instances. And I think that's an important change that we're seeing. So
what do you, just a very quick follow-up. But I think that my friends or people who, like, let's say restore an old house, or like, you know, the old PBS series, This Old House, there seem, you know, does even if it's a niche group of people, this need to kind of restore, you know, it's kind of like a want to go back to back in time, you know, I don't know if it's just as simply as preservation, or you even see, like right now, going back to the home cooked meal is becoming an art form. I took a class at University of Chicago a few years ago on the history of science, and we were talking about how once something becomes, a technology becomes obsolete, it then becomes an art form. So for example, now blacksmith is an art form. It used to be toil, and who would want to be a blacksmith? Now there's some happy person who is the one of the few blacksmiths remaining who makes great things. Or, you know, somebody who is a mason, you know, now it's considered an art form. You know, I think that's a kind of maybe a longing for that, you know, I don't know if that goes into human nature versus the human condition, but maybe it's human nature longing to go to a human condition that was prevalent for so long.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of nostalgia. But also I think there's a consumption of nostalgia, right? I mean, one of the reasons your friends are restoring houses, I assume, is because people are willing to pay more money for nostalgic houses in some way. It becomes a luxury good of sorts. But let me move on because I only got 9 minutes left. Dina. I'm going to take out my German in case I get called on German.
No call, no, don't worry. I was wondering to what extent computer technology not only cuts out human beings as makers of the human artifice, but also cuts out the possibility of starting anew, in that predictive algorithms are based on the assumption that the future will be like the past. And as some of you might know, predictive algorithms are widely used in human life, from law enforcement to healthcare. And what happens is that you basically take past data and you attach it to a definition of success and then predict what the future outcome will be. And in the way that it cuts out, arguably, starting anew, is that it could mean that actions would not be a new beginning with a unpredictable end, but that the repetition of a past action is what is considered new, but is really not new, and then it has a definite outcome.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and it's one that Arendt it's actually one of the main theses of the book. So if you'll remember earlier on in this chapter on public and private, we read about the law of large numbers. I don't know if you remember that, but in that, what she says is that in the law of large numbers, increasingly action is less effective at starting something new, because, you know, if someone gets up and says, I have a dream, and, you know, and yet everyone thinks, oh, well, that's just an outlier, you know, and we have a normalized society, and we have algorithms that cut out the chafe and keep everything in the normal, that's not going to be seen or heard. And so it's going to be harder and harder for new ideas to be heard. And so she thinks that we're entering a world in which the typical ways of human action to speak or stand in the middle of the road and block the road are going to be, you know, the fact that you protest now and the police arrest you, you get arrested, you get processed, you get let out. These things are no longer actions, and you have to do heavier and heavier actions in order to get noticed. And the result is that when you finally do storm the Capitol, you get arrested, because it's harder to do action that isn't illegal, that is going to get noticed and taken seriously. And so part of what she's going to argue at the end of the book is that the locus of action has switched from politics and art. So the poets, you know, we have Blake, the poets are the legislators of the world. It's harder and harder, she thinks, for poets to make a difference. It's going to be harder and harder for politicians to make a difference. And she's going to argue at the end of the book that the last group of people who can make a difference, who can actually act in the world in ways that can change the world, are the scientists. And that's because what scientists can do is create algorithms, create new processes, create a nuclear weapon, create a nuclear, you know, energy, create things that will then have unintended consequences down the road, but will actually change the world. And so she's going to say in the last, I think, few chapters of the book, that the last people who actually can act in the world are the scientists. You know, which is one of the reasons why, you know, it's important to study and understand science today, because that's where the action is, to use an Arendtian term.
Except that she also says that we may not no longer she differentiates between know-how and thinking, and that we may no longer be able to understand what it is, the know-how that we've developed. So we live in a world where we're not comprehending each other anymore.
Absolutely. And so she, you know, this is to go back to John, this is sort of her despair. These scientists are going to change the world, but do so in a way that is going to be increasingly inhuman. But that's why it's important to have humanist scientists. But even then, what she's going to say is that, you know, we can't predict the way these things are going to happen. You're going to insert things into the world and it's going to change. And we can never know how it works itself out. But that's in the last few pages of the book, so we'll get there. But yes, it's a good point. You're right on. Alex, I think you get the last question.
Great, Alex. Thanks, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I was wondering, I guess I had a question about this theme of the enduring quality of the world, and you know, our human need to kind of be surrounded by things that are not, you know, going to be as fleeting as I guess our own lives. And I mean, I'm very curious about that, because on the one hand, that seems to be really something essential about the human condition. It seems like if we don't have that, if we don't have a kind of world to stand on, we really couldn't, we can't really take any action. We can't really even have any bearing in the world. I mean, there wouldn't be a world, I suppose. And so our human being kind of collapses, if there isn't that ground, so to speak. But then I'm also thinking on the other side, my readings of, let's say, Sartre, or let's say Heidegger, where there is this theme of, I guess it has different names, but one name is the bad faith, right? Something you read in Sartre, which is that we have this tendency to want to evade our finitude, to want to kind of attach, identify with things that are permanent so that we wouldn't have to face anxiety, right? And I guess I'm trying to make my way through sort of these two sides, because Arendt seems to be kind of affirming and encouraging identifying with the world, but then you have this other kind of thinking, I guess a more existentialist kind of thinking that says, well, if we identify with the world, then we're going to miss something essential about the human condition. This other aspect of finitude and, the fact that we do end as beings. And I'm just wondering, first of all, maybe Arendt is actually much more existential than that I can see. So that, I guess, is one of my questions. And also maybe just your take on, how do you navigate that kind of, those two, it's almost like there are two forces, one that pulls us to the world, and there is another force, something more existential and opens onto anxiety and death and these other kinds of phenomena.
Thanks, Alex. It's a nice question. Certainly Arendt has a grounding in existentialism, and she has a wonderful essay which is worth reading called "What is Existential Philosophy," which she wrote in the I think in the 40s, not 50s. I don't know. I have to go back and look. I forget when she wrote it. And so it might be worth looking at that. She is she's not a dialectic thinker, right? So I mean, interestingly enough, you have this, you sort of set up this dialectic between sort of existence and sort of worldliness. But she does, I think you're right to say that there's a tension in her work. Not a tension. There's a recognition in her work of both the importance of what maybe in Heidegger would be called Geworfenheit, the world we're thrown into, the world in which we are born, and that world is a world of the human condition that conditions us. And for her, it is deeply human to be part of that world. And so in her essay, for example, I mean, it's not the only place, on education, she'll say that the world has a claim on us, and that's the claim of conservatism, the claim that we have to conserve the world because it's the world that we have to love and that we are born into. At the same point, she'll say we are also, as human beings, we are people who change, who will make the world different. And thus we have a claim on the world that we can change the world. And that's the claim of natality, or progressivism. And she thinks that there's always, both of these ideas are part of what it means to be human. The Sartre idea of evading our finitude, what she would say is, no, we have to embrace the fact that we are finite and that we are conditioned and we are born. And yet we have to be aware that part of that conditioning is that we have freedom to change the world. And that we are never simply an I who exists free from that in a Sartrean, in a Sartre sense. So I think it's a great question. I think it goes to the heart of a lot of her thinking. I mean, I think for Arendt, a lot of her thinking is based in this idea of, on the one hand, the power of the world, which cannot be denied, and on the other hand, the power of human freedom and natality, which cannot be denied. And she sees these things working in tandem. Again, I said not dialectically. I don't think it's dialectically. I don't think there's any kind of synthesis. But I do think it is the struggle of being human that she sees. And that's her form of existentialism, which I think is not either Sartre's or Heidegger's, but her own, if that makes sense. So thank you. It's a great question, and maybe go back and look at the what is existential philosophy essay. Look, great. It's funny. I as often the case is, I wondered if there was going to be a lot to talk about with you guys on these works, because these are not the core chapters of this text. And yet it was great. You guys did a great job, made me rethink, and I hope you had a good time. So I apologize for the scheduling snafu. The schedule on our website, I think, should be right again. We're just going through. So next week we read the next, I believe, the next 2 chapters, which means we finish the section on work. Is that right? Say that again. Oh, I don't know. So I think we're reading sections 22 and 23 for next week, and that will bring us to the end of work. That includes the section on the work of art, the permanence of the world and the work of art, which is one of the great sections of the book. So I encourage you to give yourself times to read it, and I look forward to talking with you about it next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next Friday. Thanks a lot.